Chapter 2: Madman in a Swamp. In those days when the fog lay heavy upon the great lake and fishermen spoke of poor catches and poor fortune, there lived a man called Elias. He was of middling years, with a wife grown thin from worry and a cottage mortgaged against next season's catch. Of his children, 2 lived and 3 lay beneath the earth, taken by the coughing sickness before they'd seen 4 winters. His youngest daughter had a persistent cough that wouldn't mend, no matter what remedies the herb woman tried. For 3 days, Elias had been lost on the great lake, that vast inland sea that could swallow a man whole and leave no trace. The fog had come down like a shroud, thick and damp and all-consuming, erasing sun and stars alike. His small boat drifted in a world gone grey, and a cold dread had settled deep in his bones. He had pulled up his nets for the last time. The catch was pitiful, scarce enough to feed his family for a day, let alone pay the debt he owed to Lord Tail's bailiff. Worse, some of the fish he'd caught had looked wrong. Their scales were discoloured, patchy in places, and when he'd gutted one, the flesh inside had an odd greenish tint that made him throw it back. He knew he had strayed far from his usual fishing grounds, chasing after a school of herring that had led him into unknown waters. Now he was hopelessly adrift, and the weight of his failure sat heavy in his chest. He thought of his wife waiting at home, watching the shore. He thought of the empty nets and the bailiff's ledger, where his debt grew with each passing moon. A man could die out here, he knew. Die and never be found, and his wife would lose the cottage for certain then. Then, like a blessing or a curse, a dark shape began to rise from the grey haze. Not a shoreline, but mountains, small and hunched like sleeping beasts crouched at the world's edge. A moment later he saw the dark line of trees marking land. He gripped his oar with trembling hands and steered toward it, the sound of wood dipping into water a lonely, rhythmic beat in the endless silence. As he drew closer, he saw it clear, a river mouth, a deep cut in the land where the mountains drew close together. The river flowed into the lake through a wide, tangled swamp, a place of sickly trees half drowned in black water, their skeletal branches reaching like the fingers of drowning men. The air here was heavy with the smell of rot and stagnant water. It looked like a place the gods had forgotten, or perhaps never blessed at all. Elias hesitated, his boat rocking gently in the still water. He had a choice, and neither path promised safety. He could wait here for the fog to lift, for stars to show themselves and guide him home, but that might take days, and he had neither food nor fresh water. Or he could push his boat into the river, into the swamp, and hope to find his way to land and civilization beyond. The swamp looked wrong, unnatural. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, but the thought of another night lost in the endless grey, dying slowly of thirst while his family waited and wondered, was somehow worse. He took a deep, shuddering breath, tightened his grip on the oar, and steered toward the river mouth. Into the mire. Elias pushed into the river, and with each stroke of his oar the water grew darker and stiller. The trees around him were skeletal things, their twisted, gnarled limbs rising from stagnant water like the bones of giants buried in mud. The air hung thick and heavy, tasting of decay and things long dead. He could hear the low, croaking calls of unseen creatures in the distance, and the occasional splash of something moving just beneath the surface. The sound of it made his skin crawl. He told himself it was just a swamp, just a place of tangled roots and old trees, no different from the marshes near his village. But it felt wrong. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. When he dipped his hand to taste the water, hoping against hope for something drinkable, it was brackish and foul, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw a faint greenish shimmer in it, like oil on the surface. He pulled his hand back quickly, wiping it on his tunic. This was not the fresh, clear stream he'd prayed for. This was a watery grave dressed up as salvation. He wanted to turn back, wanted it with every fibre of his being. But behind him lay only fog and death by slow degrees. Ahead, at least, lay the possibility of land. So he pushed onward, deeper into the submerged forest, his boat scraping against hidden roots, his arms aching with effort. The channel twisted and turned, narrow passages that forced him to lower his small sail and paddle by hand, pushing the oar against the muck-filled bottom. The rustling in the dense foliage along the banks was constant, a quiet, shifting sound that made his hair stand on end. He caught a glimpse of yellow eyes watching from the shadows, like chips of amber floating in the darkness. The sound of something large slipping into the water just behind his boat sent pure terror shooting through his veins. And then he heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting, a single voice weaving a melody that was both sorrowful and strangely melodic. It was so out of place in this desolate swamp that for a moment he thought his mind was finally giving way, that 3 days of fog and fear had broken something inside him. He shook his head, pushed onward. It was just the wind, he told himself. Just the swamp playing tricks on his tired mind. But as he rounded a sharp bend in the channel, the chanting grew clearer, a lonely, powerful lament that seemed to hold all the weight of the world's sorrow. It was coming from somewhere just ahead. He hesitated, his heart hammering. Was it a trap? Some swamp demon luring him to his death? He didn't know, but the sound, for all its strangeness, felt human. And right now, human meant hope. The mad hermit. Elias cautiously steered his boat through the final bend. The chanting had dissolved into a drunken slur now, the melody lost in mumbled words he couldn't understand. His eyes widened at the sight that greeted him. On a small wooden pier built from rough-hewn logs, a man lay sprawled on his back, a bottle raised to his lips. He was old, though the tangled mass of his grey beard and wild hair made it impossible to guess his true age. He was gaunt and filthy, his clothes little more than rags gone grey with grime and moss. He wore the vacant, distant expression of a man who'd lost his grip on the world and didn't care to find it again. Then, without warning, the man lurched upright with manic energy. He tossed his head back and laughed a sound like the caw of a raven and began to dance. A spastic, uncoordinated jig on the rotting planks, all flailing limbs and wild movements. He sang as he danced, mixing the sorrowful tune Elias had heard with drunken babble that made no sense at all. The man was clearly mad, utterly, completely mad. Then he slumped back down as suddenly as he'd risen, exhausted, and raised the bottle to his lips again. Elias's eyes were drawn to the collection of bottles scattered around the pier, some empty, some still sealed, one lying uncorked with its contents leaking out. The smell of fermented grain hung heavy in the air. Elias sat motionless in his boat, caught between fear and desperate need. He had stumbled upon a madman, a drunkard either lost to the world or hiding from it. But if this man was alive here, he must have fresh water, food, a way to survive. The thought of finding those things was a powerful temptation. He could try to slip past unnoticed in the fog, or he could risk everything, approach this dangerous lunatic, and beg for help. Every instinct screamed to flee, but his throat was parched dry, and the promise of water was a lure he couldn't resist. With trembling hands, he picked up his oar and began to push his boat toward the pier. The green light. As Elias drew closer, he noticed something that froze the blood in his veins. A few scattered candles on the pier provided flickering yellow light, but there was also another light, an eerie green glow that had no source he could see. It came from beneath the planks of the pier itself, a soft, pulsating radiance that shifted in hue from sickly green to deeper emerald. The sight sent dread coursing through him. This wasn't just a drunk hermit. There was something unnatural at work here. That manic dance, the impossible energy the man had shown, it suddenly made terrible sense. It wasn't drunkenness. It was something else. Something fueled by that strange, unholy light. He had made a terrible mistake. He didn't want the water anymore. He wanted to flee, as far and as fast as his boat could carry him. He turned, pushing off from the pier with a desperate shove of his oar. But it was too late. The snoring stopped. The man on the pier lifted his head, and the wild look was gone from his eyes. They were clear now, sharp, focused, far more terrifying than the drunken vacancy had been. "And where are you going?" the man asked, his voice no longer a slur but a cold, clear command. "The fog isn't lifting for days." Elias froze, his hands gripping the oar so hard his knuckles went white. "Beer?" the man asked, sitting up fully now. "Or water?" His voice was impossibly clear, impossibly sober, sending new chills down Elias's spine. Before Elias could answer, the man's eyes rolled back in his head. He fell backward onto the pier with a heavy thump, like a stone dropped from a great height. Deep, guttural snoring rattled from his chest. Elias stared, bewildered. It was a chance. Maybe his only chance. He grabbed the oar and began to push with all his strength, the water sucking at the hull of his boat. He was so close to escape. So close. The man shot upright again, not with the slow movements of waking but with the terrifying speed of a striking snake. His eyes, now wide and burning with strange intensity, fixed on Elias. "So," he said again, his voice sharp as broken glass, "beer or water? I might find something stronger if you fancy it." Elias stared, his hands frozen on the oar. This was no simple drunkard. The frantic energy, the sudden collapses, the immediate revivals, this was something beyond his understanding. He was trapped. The choice was no longer about escaping the swamp. It was about what terrible price he'd pay to leave it alive. "Water," Elias whispered. "Please, just water." By the fire. Elias sat by a small fire, the crackle of burning wood a welcome sound in the oppressive silence of the swamp. He had gulped down nearly half a flask of fresh, cold water, the most blessed thing he'd tasted in 3 days. Now a murky, bitter beer was warming his belly, and he felt almost human again. The man sat across from him, surprisingly calm now. His wild hair and beard framed a face that was sharp and clear in the firelight, not mad at all, but possessed of a strange, unsettling intelligence. He was preparing a piece of meat over the flames, turning it with a long, elegant twig. The green light still pulsed beneath the pier, but here by the fire it felt less threatening, almost natural, though Elias knew it was anything but. With his thirst quenched and his terror somewhat abated, Elias finally found his voice. "I'm lost," he began, the words hesitant. "The fog came down, and I need to find my way back to the main lake, back to my village." The man looked up, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to see straight through flesh to bone. "The fog will not lift for 3 days, he said, his voice a low, melodic hum. "You are at the confluence of the River Elder and the Great Lake. Your home lies 3 days' journey east from the river mouth, in the lee of the Corbin Mountains." Elias's breath caught. The man had named his home region without asking, had described the very mountains that sheltered his village. But the hermit wasn't finished. He went on to describe the topography of the surrounding area with unnerving detail, naming streams Elias had never heard of, describing hidden currents in the lake that even the oldest fishermen didn't know. He spoke of wind patterns and the way water flowed through channels beneath the surface. He even described Elias's village, naming its streets and landmarks with casual precision. "The eastern shore," the man said at one point, his voice taking on a strange quality, "is forbidden by ducal decree. Has been for 20 years. No one remembers why anymore, but the law stands. You came close to it in your wandering, closer than you should have. The fog there is different. It doesn't lift the way normal fog does. It lingers, waits. And the fish that swim near those waters," he paused, his eyes distant. "They're changing, slowly. Their flesh takes on strange colors. Their scales grow wrong, Fishermen who eat them fall sick with fevers that won't break." He paused, falling silent for a moment, his face suddenly troubled. Then he shook his head as though clearing it and continued as though nothing had interrupted him. The knowledge was so precise, so intimate, that Elias could confirm parts of it from his own experience. The currents were exactly as described. The wind patterns matched what he'd learned in his years on the water. But the rest, the hidden streams, the detailed geography, the knowledge of his village was impossible. No one, not even the Lord Surveyors, knew the lake and land so completely. As the hermit spoke, he would occasionally fall over mid-sentence, as if some sudden exhaustion had seized him. He'd snore loudly for a minute or two, then jerk upright and continue his explanation exactly where he'd left off, as though no interruption had occurred. He was a paradox. A man both lucid and insane, sober and drunk, a fountain of impossible wisdom contained in a vessel of chaos. The hermit finished his meal and cut a small piece of the salted meat for Elias, who took it with trembling hands. "Eat," the man commanded. "You have a long journey ahead." But with this he pulled out a small piece of cured hide and began drawing on it with a piece of charcoal. Within minutes, he'd created a map. A perfect map filled with symbols and lines that showed every current, every hazard, every safe passage between this cursed swamp and Elias's home. "You will not get lost again." Elias stared at the map, his hands shaking. It was everything he needed, but accepting it felt like accepting something more, some bargain he didn't understand. I don't know how to repay you," he stammered. The madman gave a small, weary smile. "Go," he said quietly. "And if you wish to fill your nets, put them at the mouth of the western current, half a day's journey from the shoreline. The lake gives its bounty there, if you know where to ask." The return. Elias folded the hide map carefully, tucking it into his tunic against his skin. He thanked the man, called him master and benefactor and savior, though none of those words seemed quite right. The hermit just waved him off with an impatient gesture. Following the precise directions, Elias navigated out of the swamp. He found the river mouth, then used the symbols on the map to locate the western current. Almost as an afterthought, he cast his nets exactly where the madman had suggested. When he pulled them up, they came heavy with a shimmering, silvery bounty. More fish than he'd caught in a month. More than enough to feed his family and clear his debt with plenty to spare. He returned home a hero. His wife met him at the dock with tears of relief, having given him up for dead. The whole village turned out to see his catch, marveling at the weight of it. The next day, as the morning boats were being prepared, Elias found himself on the pier with the other fishermen. Someone asked about his catch, where he'd found such bounty after 3 days lost in the fog. He told his tale, described the endless grey, the terrifying swamp, the mad hermit who'd helped him. The fishermen laughed, their faces lit with good-natured amusement. "A madman in the eastern swamp?" One of them, a grizzled man named Tomas, guffawed. "That's a good one, Elias. Next you'll be telling us he was a river spirit, or one of the old gods come down from the mountains." But Elias pressed on, sharing the details. He spoke of the river Elder and its winding path, the strange currents in the lake, the specific fishing grounds the hermit had named. The older fishermen, men with decades on the water, couldn't help but agree with some of the details. The currents were right. The wind patterns matched. The location of that western fishing ground, they'd heard rumors of it, but no one had known exactly where it was. How'd this drunk hermit know all that? One of them asked, skepticism giving way to unease. "He knew things," Elias said quietly. "Things no drunk should know. Things no man should know. He drew me a map, and it was perfect. Perfect as if the gods themselves had drawn it." The fishermen fell silent at that. Some of them made signs against evil. Others just shook their heads and went about their work, unwilling to think too hard about what it might mean. But Elias knew the truth. He had a map tucked away in his cottage, a strange and beautiful thing that contains secrets of the world. He had escaped the fog and the swamp, but he'd been touched by something far beyond his understanding. He was a fisherman who knew too much now, and he knew, with cold certainty, that the world was a far stranger and more dangerous place than he'd ever imagined. He fell asleep with those questions unanswered, and dreamed of green light and yellow eyes and a voice that knew every secret the world tried to keep hidden.